And those regions are about, what, 80% ethnic Russian or
Russian speakers.
Russian speakers.
Yeah. I think the Russians will not try to conquer territory that is in the western half of Ukraine, because that territory is filled with ethnic Ukrainians, and they would resist mightily against Russian control. So I think the Russians will focus on taking territory that is filled with Russian speakers and ethnic Russians. And I think that at some point there will be an end to the war, but that end will not mean a meaningful peace agreement. The best you can hope for, I think, is a cold peace, similar to what you have in Korea along the 38th parallel. So I think this problem is not going away. The fighting may stop in a few years or maybe even a few months. Who knows for sure? But the conflict will remain, and I wouldn't be surprised if fighting broke out again in 5 or 10 years.
So the West will not escalate to push the Russians back, or that in some ways is a good message to my ears, because the fighting.
The West can escalate. It can't escalate for two reasons. First of all, unless they put boots on the ground, they can't do anything to change the population balance between the two sides, right? The Ukrainians need many more soldiers, and they just don't have a large enough population to find those soldiers. And furthermore, in terms of giving weaponry to the Ukrainians, the West doesn't have the weapons or the industrial capacity to produce those weapons at this point in time. They may have that in 2 or 3 or 5 years, but that's too late. So there's not much the West can do at this point in time to shift the balance in Ukraine's favor.
Okay.
I would just add one quick point, Max. I think it's very important to understand that when the West first got into this war in early 2022, and it looked like the Ukrainians were doing very well on the battlefield, and we had initiated the sanctions.
Right.
I believe that people in the West felt that those sanctions would do enormous damage to the Russian economy, and that's what would allow the West plus the Ukrainians to win the war. In other words, the Ukrainians would do fine on the battlefield, but those economic sanctions would deliver a hammer blow to Russia, and that would allow us in the West to prevail. But the key here is that the sanctions didn't work as anticipated. You know, people often talk about Putin miscalculating, and I'm sure that Putin has miscalculated in certain ways. Miscalculation is part of the warp and woof of daily life in international politics. But I think the West also miscalculated in certain ways. And most importantly, I think the West miscalculated in thinking that sanctions would work to devastate Russia's economy.